This is KZSU, Stanford. Welcome to Entitled Opinions. My name is Robert Harrison, and we're coming to you from the Stanford campus. I can't tell you how many times I get asked the question, and what's that have to do with Italian literature? As if being a professor of Italian literature didn't have something to do with just about everything. For those who know not only the letter but the spirit of its tradition, there is very little of any import that does not have something to do with Italian literature. Professor of Comparative Literature? Banal, triste, vapid. Professor of French and Italian Literature? I use that title occasionally, mostly when I'm with French diplomats. But as my good friend Anna Maria Napoletano once said before she joined the giant family, it's so elegant, Roberto, when they introduce you as Professor of Italian Literature. Anna Maria knew a thing or two about flair, but apart from the elegance of it, for an intellectual, there is nothing, but nothing, that beats being a professor of Italian literature. As long as you get it, that is, and know what it is that you're professing. Italian departments in the United States tend to be minuscule, maladapted, and marginal. In fact, they are among the most marginalized programs in the entire university, which is ironic given that the Italian literary tradition is absolutely central to the canon of the humanities and several other fields as well. That tradition is like Orpheus, the poet of incantation who descended into the underworld to retrieve his wife Eurydice, but who could not refrain from casting an anxious look backwards to see if she was behind him, against the express injunction of Pluto not to turn around until he had climbed back into the light. Mourning the second death of his twice-lost wife, Orpheus was impervious to the blandishments of other women, and one day he so frustrated a crowd of angry maenads that they tore his body apart and dispersed its fragments across the land. Something like that also happened to the body of Italian literature, which has been strewn here and there across the university. Its Roman limbs are claimed by departments of classics. St. Francis belongs to religious studies. Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, who form the matrix of British literature, are taught in translation in English departments. Machiavelli, the founder of modern political theory, is under formaldehyde in political science departments. Galileo belongs to physics, Leonardo to the history of science, Michelangelo to architecture and art history, Vivaldi to music, Antonioni to film studies, and so forth. I taught a course just recently called Italian Lyric Poetry, the Greatest Hits, which began with St. Francis and ended with the contemporary poet Fabrizio Falconi. It was my most recent reminder that there is poetry and then there is Italian poetry. Or, as Stendhal once said about Parmesan, il y a le fromage et le parmesan. Of the 40 or so poets we read over the course of the semester, at least 35 times I told myself that there's a fascinating dissertation to be written here. Even with a poet as well known as Torquato Tasso, I had the feeling that, as a sonneteer, he is still terra incognita, a continent of lyric poetry still waiting to be discovered. You would think that if the English department at Stanford has 35 professors, which it does, then Italian should have at least 100 of them. But things don't work out that way. We are 3.5 professors in Italian, 1 for every 10 faculty members in English. But that's all right. We like it that way. It gives us the advantage of a low profile and allows us to hear all the more intimately the disembodied voice that mourns the white-shouldered Eurydice. I have with me in the studio the person who is by any measure the leading Italianist in the United States, Giuseppe Mazzotta, a professor of Italian literature, fully worthy of that appellation. Professor Mazzotta is visiting us here at Stanford from Yale, where he holds the title of Sterling Professor of Humanities for Italian. He is the author of many major books on Dante, on Boccaccio, on Petrarch, on Vico, and on Renaissance humanism. I should mention that prior to going to Yale in 1983, Giuseppe taught Italian literature at Cornell University, where yours truly studied with him as a graduate student. Indeed, I first met him when I was living La Dolce Vita in Rome back in 1979, in the days when self-dissipation and poetry went hand in hand, at least for me. And one evening after dinner, Giuseppe told me, "I want you to come and work with me at Cornell." A fellowship offer arrived in the mail. I said to myself, why not? And took off the next year for Ithaca, New York. I ended up writing a dissertation on Dante a few years after that with Professor Mazzotta, and the rest is history. Giuseppe, it's a real pleasure to welcome you on Entitled Opinions.
Thank you. Good to be here. And I have been here before, and returning to this place, it's really a little bit of nostalgia for me. You mentioned Anna Maria Napolitano in your introductory remarks, who are a noble woman.
Noble woman, yeah. No longer with us, but now part of that Orphic nostalgia for both of us, I believe. I made a few claims about the grandeur or the uniqueness of Italian literature.
You did,
and,
indeed.
I did that actually in a serious spirit, I have to say, because I feel fully committed to it. And is there anything about the tradition in general, before we speak about specifics, that you would like to say about the Italian literary tradition?
Yeah, well, what's the specificity of this culture that you present the fragmented body of the culture? That's true. I don't want to take a nostalgic view of the past as something irretrievable or something that is long gone, and now we are really in a mode of decadence. In fact, I will try to answer your question. We could really talk about this question for the rest of the hour. But, what's the specificity of Italian culture? What is that makes it a little bit different from all others? That's a very good question. I could mention 2-3 elements. I think that one can say that Italian culture is the only Western culture which systematically addresses issues of the classical tradition within which Italian culture is rooted, and the biblical component, the biblical stream, and makes one the standpoint, the perspective for the critique of the other. And this is true really from the time of Dante and all the way down to Fellini and Pasolini and all the others, without going through Tasso. You mentioned Tasso, Vico, Manzoni. And so this is really the heart of the Italian tradition. Another aspect that you touch with this whole idea of how Italian is the dismembered body in all departments. In a sense, that's part of the way that it was assimilated, that it's part of its success.
Sure.
Italian is no longer viewed as some kind of other that you have to study as a mystery, an enigma, and etc. I think it's the encyclopedism of Italian culture. You're right. You touch on that there is the architecture, and these activities were always and have always been in conversation with each other. So in fact, I think that encyclopedism is the only way to approach the challenges of Italian culture. And I can talk about other things. I think that the thing that really gives a unity to and a specificity to Italian culture is really Rome. As you know, I know that you wrote one of your splendid books was exactly on Rome and the whole myth of Rome. But I always say that most people, the geographers, will tell you that Rome is that city in Italy. And if you believe geographers, that's true. But I think that it's the other way around. Italy is that country which is in Rome. And I think that the story of the universality of Rome has actually become the characteristic of Italian culture. Other cultures, I really have to qualify this. Of course, in France, you have some episodic moments of the classical world. It's rooted in Latin and the classical tradition, but l'âge classique, as they call it, is really a moment of it. Spain, England, English literature, of course, they had the classical period. But in Italy, the Roman temptation, for better and for worse, has always been with us. It's an extraordinary thing. Yeah.
And you mentioned that the classicism is in a kind of relationship with the biblical, or say
yes,
the Christian,
absolutely.
and it's often a tense relationship. Would you agree?
Absolutely, I think so. I think that look at the recent history of Rome. 1929, the Italian state finally signs the agreement with the Vatican in order to really make the Italian Catholics part of the political life of the country, and they open up Via della Conciliazione, which is all a program, a reconciliation between church and state. But when Mussolini was marching down, he really began celebrating the whole idea of the pagan Roman past, which, of course, for the church meant the whole reconciliation meant something altogether different. In the culture of throughout the history of Italian culture, whether it's Petrarch, whether it's Dante, the Neoplatonists of the Renaissance, or that's clearly a tense relationship, as it ought to be.
Can I ask a specific question here about Dante and Petrarch in their appropriation of the classical? We know that the Divine Comedy is an extraordinarily Christian poem, but which rescues or retrieves the whole classical world within its within its mind. And Dante's relationship to Virgil is very significant, and there's a lot of pathos involved there. But not only Virgil, there are a number of other poets as well, many of them in limbo. The common wisdom is that between Dante and Petrarch, who is often considered the father of Renaissance humanism, that the attitude towards antiquity has undergone a significant change, if not a revolution. Petrarch's relation to the ancients is not what Dante's relation to the ancients was. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that, but I think that strangely, I would emphasize the amount of agreement between Dante and Petrarch. You mentioned there's two of them. One point, a common point of reference, is really St. Augustine's reading of Rome, and it's clear from the City of God, whether you read the sections on Varro in the two great books of the City of God, Book 5 and Book 6, which is an extraordinary critique of the ideology of the empire, Varro being the librarian of Caesar, etc. Or you go on reading the larger polemic with the Virgilian Empire. Both for different reasons, both Dante and Petrarch disagree with Augustine. For one, there is such a thing as the empire for Dante. For the other, there is the empire of culture. He no longer shares the values